The interesting thing about Whiskeye is it's got whiskers and eyes. So it's the first robot we built of this kind, which is multisensory. So we're looking at the fusion of whiskers and touch. You can see that it's got this big sort of brush of whiskers at the front. That's because mice and rats have, as well as long whiskers, they have microvibrissae on their chin and lips, which are like the fovea of the bristle sensing system. So this robot runs this brain model that I mentioned, and I hope you agree that it's generating quite lifelike behavior. It's using its whiskers to detect targets for attention, and then it's investigating those with these microvibrissae on the tip of the snout. So we've also done a lot of work with the iCub robot. This was particularly with Daniel Camilleri, who's a colleague now in the spin-out. And we were looking there again at active sensing, but also at episodic memory, how to create memories for robots which are a bit more like human memory. When you're involved in some event, like coming to this talk, you don't record everything like a movie, like Zoom. You selectively remember stuff which was interesting and potentially useful to you. And we'd like to create that kind of memory for robots. Right now, a robot can store everything that happens, but it's pretty useless at using that information. So next time it meets you, it probably won't be able to recognize you as a social robot. It almost certainly won't be able to remember what you're talking about or other significant things that happen. We'd love to have social robots that could do both of those things, which is why we've worked on bio-inspired synthetic memory. And more broadly, I've worked on this idea of giving the robot a sense of itself. And by that, I mean a sense of itself as a physical entity, knowing what is the robot and what is not the robot. It's a very basic idea of self, the self-other distinction. I don't know of any social robot right now that has a self-other distinction. It doesn't know where it ends. It doesn't even know that it's a thing, of course, but it certainly doesn't know its limits. And people are working with iCub and other robots to try and create a model for the robots that it knows what objects in the world belong to it, what are part of its body, and what are not. And then there are other aspects of self, such as this idea of the self in time. So this episodic memory is what I call the spatiotemporal self, the ability to remember yourself in the past, and also to think about and imagine yourself in the future. These are both critical aspects of the human sense of self, completely missing right now in robots. Robots can't remember their own past. They're not aware that they have a future. When you interact with a person, you assume that they have both of these things. They have a self with a distinction. They have memory of past and they know there's future. When you interact with a social robot, it has none of this understanding. And a further thing that social robots could usefully have is a sense of others, what I would call an interpersonal self. So the ability to know that there are other social agents out there, including humans, and of course that humans have minds of their own, they have intentions, they have ideas, they think thoughts which are different to what the robot is thinking. It would be great to give robots that sense of self as well, the capacity to know that there are other agents. And we know that in children, that kind of sense of self develops relatively slowly. It's around in age 3 that children achieve what psychologists call a theory of mind, knowledge that other people have minds of their own. And we can look at developmental psychology and get ideas of how to create these things for robots. So I'm going to talk for the rest of the talk about applications of robotics and how we can build more useful and more helpful robots. This is a robot. Let me try and move this. There we go. This is a robot called Miro. Hands up if you've met Miro. Oh, great. Okay, so a few people have. So it's in quite a few labs around the world, particularly in the UK and Europe. It's also being used in teaching in schools and some universities, particularly our University of Sheffield. It was co-created with Sebastian Conran, who's a British industrial designer, and Ben Mitchinson, who is a software developer and worked also on the whiskered robots. So actually, what we built for the whiskered robots, we took it and we simplified it for the control system that works inside the Miro robot. This is the version of Miro that was running about 5 years ago. One of the people who worked at the Swiss Embassy in Washington made this film. So she's holding the camera in the hand. She's interacting with Miro, who has touch sensors on his head and body, and is responding to touch. And of course, you can see it's also got stereo cameras, and it's got 2 ears, both of which are microphones. So it's got stereo hearing. So Miro is looking out in the world. It's also responding to touch. Right now, he's noticed something else of interest in the world, and he's going to move off and explore. So you can see over here, this gentleman runs the bar at the Swiss Embassy in Washington. So he'd never met a robot before. He was waving his hands, making noise. That attracted the attention of the robot. The robot goes over to explore and investigate and interact. What you don't get in this video is the sound, because Miro also makes noises. So it's a basic animal-like robot. It does animal-like things, exploring and interacting with people. It has a control system inspired by the mammalian brain. That's the brain of a rat, sort of sliced back to front, showing you the cortex, the midbrain, and the brainstem, the basic divisions of the mammalian brain. This is the architecture on the left that we've built for Miro. We've got a brainstem or a sort of spinal cord-like system, which is a bunch of reflexes, things to stop it going off cliffs and things. Then we've got the real center of Miro's brain right now is the sensor fusion and action generation module. And that's based around a spatial map of the world around the robot's head. So it tries to work out what's happening and what's interesting in the world, and then it decides whether or not to approach it. And it also has an emotion system that affects and colors what action it does. So when we want to build all those things in the top box, we've got sort of prototypes of some of these, but largely that's a work in progress. So we've essentially got a model of an animal, but really just the midbrain, the brainstem. So just wanted to see what's happening. So when Miro is looking to interact with people, and it's detected that gentleman who's waving his hands, what it's really doing is modeling the way the midbrain, the human midbrain and the mammalian midbrain detects things of interest in the world. And the midbrain is particularly interested in things that move and that make sound, and particularly if something moves and makes sounds in the same part of space, that's really interesting. So this is a person walking in front of Miro and clicking their fingers like that. And so the pulses are when that person is clicking their fingers. The shape you can see is them moving across in front of the robot. So actually all the robot sees when that gentleman from the Swiss Embassy is waving at it is there's some bright points in this salience map around its head, and is picking out the brightest point and so I'm going to go and investigate that. We can also impose a face detector onto this, so it particularly is interested in faces, but actually, and generally you don't need that, because the things that move and make sound tend to be humans or other robots. So the robot will go and investigate either of those quite happily without having to look for faces. If you think about a human infant will fixate human faces. Actually, human infant has a cortex, but it's not wired up yet. So there are lots of cells there, but no connections. Essentially, it's running a brainstem system, not unlike this, but with a face detector, so that the eyes are attracted towards faces. It's actually running quite a simple template for faces that will pick out 2 eyes and a mouth. That's enough for a child to think that there's a face. So children will look at dolls and things quite happily, thinking that they're faces. I've got a bunch of pictures of Miro, of course, in my Mac Photos album. The Apple Photos app, as you probably know, picks out faces and says, here's lots of pictures of this person. So it's picked out Miro and said that Miro is a person. So obviously it has a face detector, which isn't that much more sophisticated. It can't tell this robot from a human face. So Miro has a model of emotion that colors its behavior. It's a two-dimensional model. This is research from social psychology on the right, dividing the world of human emotion into two dimensions. You can see that horizontally, there's pleasant or unpleasant, or good or bad if you prefer. And vertically, there's low and high arousal. And then you can put pretty much any of the human emotions into this two-dimensional space. Sometimes people have three dimensions. One of my jokes is that in engineering, you only need one. But this is good for capturing most of what humans do. And we can do this with Miro as well. So Miro has a 2D emotional space. It goes and it uses its lights to communicate emotions. When it's happy, it glows green. When it's angry, it goes red. And also it goes from low to high arousal. So when it's sleepy, it just switches off. And when it's aroused, it will run around more quickly and so on. So the sort of things that make Miro happy is when you stroke it and then it wags its tail, which children seem to find very rewarding. And the sort of things that make it angry when you punch it on the nose. Kids tend to like to poke it in the eye. We don't yet have a way of detecting that. So this is my daughter actually interacting with Miro, showing that the emotions color the behavior of the robot. So you can see it wagging its tail because it's happy. So we're interested in how you could use this to support applications in care and in therapy. Obviously, the robot can't look after you directly, but what it can do is it can have a calming influence. And we're testing that in schools, particularly in schools for children with special educational needs, where sometimes children are quite distressed and upset, and we think that interacting with a social robot like Miro could have a calming effect. And it could also be true, of course, with people of any age, that interacting with a social robot could have some of the benefits of interacting with an animal, such as an animal companion. So this is a nice study from the University of Southampton by Olivia Barber. They compared interacting with Miro with interacting with a dog. And what they found was that children spent a similar amount of time stroking Miro as they did with the dog. And also, although children said they preferred interacting with the living dogs, they actually expressed more positive emotions when interacting with Miro. So it does seem to work. And in our own experience of public engagement, we've seen kids sort of sit and cuddle the robot for 10, 15 minutes without a break. And I think it genuinely does have a calming effect. This is a study done by Emily Collins, who did a PhD with me. She's now in Tufts in the US. And this is actually a cross-cultural study in the UK and Japan, and with both Miro and Paro robots. Paro, you may know, is a sort of furry seal-like robot. And we use this scale, which is the felt security scale, to measure before and after. And this scale is now translated into Japanese. So if anybody wants to do cross-cultural studies in this area, then you have this scale. It's been validated for both countries. And it asks people to rate themselves on questions like, I feel comforted, I feel supported, I feel looked after, and so on. And what we found was that both Miro and Paro showed a positive improvement in felt security after really quite a short interaction. For some reason, the people interacting with Paro were higher initially, but both the people interacting with Paro and with Miro showed an improvement as a result of just, I think, 5–10 minutes of interaction with the robot. I think physical interaction has something to do with that. So I don't think you'd get these effects with an avatar, but physically interacting with the robot, maybe with Paro's fur, also there's a benefit there, but I think it helps. So quickly to tell you about our other spin-out, which is called CyberCells. CyberCells came out of public engagement work we did with lots of robots, including Pepper and Miro, and we were disappointed with the lack of interesting behavior in social robots. So we decided to use robot telepresence, and we worked a lot on that. And we also were disappointed in that you couldn't just program the behavior and have it in different robots. You always have to write a new program for each robot. So CyberCell has created a new interface called Animus that supports already a dozen different robots. So you can write the program through Animus and it will be able to work in all these different robots without changing a line of code. You can also do it on lots of different platforms. And the idea is that this is a modular system where you can start to add robot skills. The first skills that we've got is telepresence. So this is early on one of our experiments in robot telepresence, trying to do both sort of visual telepresence and also haptics through the glove there. With telepresence, the time lag between you making a movement and the robot moving is really important, because if it's too long, and if it's too long to get the visual feedback from the robot, then it can be quite unpleasant and people start to feel sick. So we've really worked on making the time lag as short as possible. So if you use sort of standard protocols for web communications with robot telepresence, you might have a time lag of 200 to 300 milliseconds, which is a bit too long. And we've got that to sub 100 milliseconds, about 80 milliseconds. And that's including over long distances. So we could do it from here to the UK and you would get a very seamless, fast loop of interaction. So that system, which we call Teleport, is being used right now with this robot, the PAL Tiago. So this is the Tiago being teleoperated to do a cup stacking task. If you look on YouTube, you can find videos of people doing cup stacking. It's a competition, and the best people can stack these cups into sort of a matter of seconds. So we're not quite as quick as that, but it's quite, I think we're doing quite well in terms of remote controlling the robot to do manual dexterity. Right now, we're also working with TouchLab, who are an Edinburgh-based robotic startup. They're doing tactile sensing for robots, and we've teamed up for the Anna Avatar X Prize competition in November, where we'll both be working with the PAL Tiago, a two-arm Tiago, to do lots of difficult tasks and hopefully do well in that competition. So look out for us. It's I think it's the first week of November, and it's the final, and there's a $10 million prize. We're in the last 20. I'd be surprised if we won the 10 million, but if we're in the top 10, we'll be very delighted. So that took a bit longer than I thought, so I'll try and be a bit quicker with the rest of the talk. So we've already had an introduction to social robotics, so I don't need to tell you much about social robots. What I'm interested in is how people see social robots. And you may have come across Daniel Dennett's idea of the intentional stance. Hands up if you've heard of the intentional stance. So not many of you. Okay, well, the intentional stance is this view that Daniel Dennett's put forward, that people tend to take an intentional stance towards other people. That is, we see other people as having, like you, intentions and goals and desires and beliefs and so on. So that when you interact with somebody, you're interacting with them on their basis. You're trying to figure out what they want to do, why they want to do it. And this is interesting because there are lots of other stances you could take towards an agent, such as a person or a robot. So for example, you can think of it as a physical system. So a physical system like a robot, you know that if it fell over, it might break because it's made of physical stuff, and that might be a bit fragile. You can also think of it as a designed mechanism. So robots are designed by people, and you can think about it and analyze it in terms of what the designers were trying to do when they made it. You can think of it as intentional, as having beliefs and goals, but beyond that, you might also think of it as phenomenological. Dennett didn't really talk about this, but other people have. And so you might think of it as having a sense of self, of having an experience of being something, of having an inner life. So these are different stances that we could take towards a robot. We could see it as just a physical thing. We could see it as designed. We could see it as intentional. We could see it as phenomenological. Which stance do you take towards a robot? Well, It probably depends on a lot of different things. So there's going to be individual differences, of course, and some of those might be to do with things like age and gender, and talk about that. There could be cultural expectations. So if you've seen a lot of science fiction movies, maybe you're more likely to have a more phenomenological stance towards robots. You know, you've seen Blade Runner, you've seen the characters in Blade Runner who are supposed to be robots talking about their inner life and so on. It could be to do with physical appearance. So if the robot looks like a person, you might be more likely to take an intentional stance than if it looks like a machine. It could be to do with behavior, how the behavior looks compared to human behavior. It could be to do with whether it appears to be acting of its own volition. I'll talk a bit more about that. It could be that we just don't have alternative explanations of this behavior. So if somebody was to explain to you about the program that was running inside the robot, that might change your stance. So Agnieszka Witowska and her group in Genoa have done a lot of work on this, and they've shown that people, or some people, adopt an intentional stance towards particularly humanoid robots. They've done work with the iCover in particular, and this also is with Angelo. And they've shown that under certain conditions, the intentional stance is more strongly brought out. For example, if the robot is behaving in a way that looks as though it has intentions rather than behaving relatively randomly. So one of the things that might encourage people to take an intentional stance is if the robot is expressive. So quite a lot of social robots have an emotional expression of some sort. Miro expresses its emotions through colors of movement and sound. More humanoid robots often do it in terms of facial expressions. These are some examples here. So I want to tell you about a study we did with Zeno, which is a robot from Hanson Robotics. Zeno has, I think, 5 actuators in the face that can make facial expressions. You can judge for yourself how lifelike you think these are, but it can smile, it can frown, it can look horrified, and so on. This is also the same system, a sort of cut-down version of it that ran in the Sophia robot that you may have heard of, and I'll talk a bit more about Sophia shortly. So this is Zeno just running through his demo of expressions. We did a study. Well, let me just, before I go on to that, let me just tell you about this other study. So one of the things that might affect your view of robots is how old you are, because as we grow up, we change our understanding and our attitude towards things generally. So we did a developmental study. This was led by David Cameron, comparing, I think it was 6 and 7-year-olds on how they saw Zeno. And we gave them a very simple question. So you've got a scale here. You just need to mark on this line whether you think Zeno is more like a machine or more like a person after interacting or observing Miro for a few minutes. And this came up with a really interesting result, actually. So if you've got like a person on the y-axis is there, like a machine is the more negative numbers, then you see that the 6-year-olds are much more likely to say that Zeno was like a person. And the 7-year-olds were more likely to say that Zeno was like a machine. So, and obviously we controlled for other aspects of the interaction. So what could account for this difference in how children see Zeno? Any ideas? Any developmental psychologists in the audience? It's a clue. Anyone to hazard a guess? Anyone know any 6 or 7-year-olds? It's moving in the same way for everybody, so that we're controlling that. There's something about the children themselves. Sorry? Yeah, that's roughly it. Well, I mean, we don't know, obviously, but our hypothesis is it's to do with their understanding of what a person is. And in particular, this psychologist, Susan Carey, did a lot of studies looking at children's biological understanding. And she argued that between age 6 and 7, there's a shift in children's view of what it is to be alive. So the young child takes the view that you might associate with animists. So So some people would argue that there are some sort of more primitive cultures that think that anything that moves or is active is alive. And young children seem to take that view. So a ball bouncing down a hill is active. They might think of that as alive. That's the animist perspective. She contrasts that with what she calls the vitalist perspective, which is this idea that living has more to do with certain aspects of the body. You know, that to be alive, you need to have lungs that breathe, a heart that beats, a digestive system for food, and so on. And she argued that cross-culturally, that understanding, that biologically understanding, emerges at around the same time that we're seeing this difference in how children see robots. So the young children are animist, and they're more likely to see the robot as like a person because it moves, it makes sound. The older children are more vitalist, they're less likely to see the robot as like a person because it doesn't breathe, it doesn't eat food, and so on. And when we asked kids about this, the younger kids were more likely to ask about the robot's daily life and its relationships and its interests and so on. So suggesting that they were thinking of it as a person. And the older children were more likely to ask about its abilities, its knowledge, and what robots are useful for. So again, recognizing that they think about the robot as a kind of machine. So this is an interesting shift. Just in children at quite a young age, it also suggests that at age 7, children are already quite sophisticated about how they interact with something like a social robot. And this is really interesting because David did another manipulation. So I talked about autonomy. Does the robot seem to be controlling itself? So in one of his experiments, David controlled for whether or not the children saw him switch on the demo. So there's a button on the front of Zeno which you press to activate these demos. And if he did that covertly when the children weren't looking, then they would just see the robot behaving. If he did it overtly, they would see him press a button and then the robot would do exactly the same thing. So that simple manipulation makes a huge difference. So when it appears to be autonomous, you get much better ratings. That's on the right-hand side. So when it appears to be operated, that's in the middle there. So they're much more likely to think of it as being more machine-like if they've seen him switching it on. We also looked at children's responses to expression, because Zeno does these fairly human-like facial expressions. What we did, and we could tell that the children could detect that there was an expression going on. We did an experiment, which is kind of a Simon Says experiment. You may have done these in your lab. So the children have to stand in front of the robot, and the robot gives them instructions like to jump up and down, wave their arms, and so on. And in the Simon Says game, then if the robot says Simon Says, wave your hands, you have to wave your hands. If he just says wave your hands without saying Simon Says, then you're supposed to not do it. So most kids know this game. In the experiment, there was a simple manipulation. After the child had responded to the instruction, if they got it right, so if they'd moved when Simon said jump up and down, or if they'd not moved when the robot just said jump up and down, then Zeno would smile and give them a positive expression. And if they got it wrong, he would shake his head and frown. And we controlled for that, so we turned that on and off. And the interesting thing about that experiment is we predicted that there would be a positive effect of expression on children's response to the robot. And what we did is we measured the children's face to see if they had a positive or negative expression on their face. We used a piece of software called Nolder's Face Reader. So on the y-axis, this is the measure of happiness on the kid's face. So the kids are generally quite happy playing this game. But we saw actually a marked difference when the robot was expressive compared to when it wasn't expressive. But there was an even more marked difference between boys and girls. So you can see that the boys, you got a much higher score for positive expression when the robot is expressive than if it has a still face. And with the girls, it was the other way around. And we still haven't fathomed out why we got this result. But it's interesting to see that gender is making a difference. One hypothesis And we also get another similar result actually for how close the robot comes to the person comes to the robot. So there's this idea that proxemics can indicate level of interest and attraction. So if you're closer to somebody, that's a positive indication. And we found that the boys came closer when the robot was expressive than the girls did. Yeah?
Sorry, which age children were the same age of 7?
Let me just. That's a good question. It will be in the paper. Yeah, I'd have to check in the paper. I think it was the older children. I think this was 7 to 9, but it's a good question. It's obviously, yeah. So I don't think we saw any effect of age, but you could look in the paper. One of the things that we think could be happening here is that Miro looks more like a boy than a girl. Of course, robots aren't gendered. So we did a study to ask kids whether they thought Miro was more like a boy or a girl, and 90% of them said it was more like a boy. So kids tend to think that Miro is a boy robot. Zeno is the boy robot. There is actually Hanson Robotics do a sort of girl robot version, but we haven't yet been able to get one. So a good control would be to swap out Zeno for the sort of more girl-like version of this robot to see if it was a gender-related, to do with the gender aspect of the interaction. So, okay, how much time have I got? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Could I have 15? Just wait for lunch for 5 more minutes. So I want to just give you, I'll go through this pretty quick. So Miro reproaches people and it responds to them and it displays behavior that you might consider to be emotional. So do you think that that is deception? Do you think that that's deceptive? Anybody think that that's deceptive? And this is a definition of deception. The use of signals or representations to convey misleading or false impression. Nobody thinks that's deceptive?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good. Okay, let me give you another robot, more controversial. You might have heard of Sophia. This is a video of Sophia. Let me see if I can get it to play. No, I think it's playing there. But I haven't got any sound, but you can see what they're saying. Does everyone come across Sophia? You heard of Sophia? Yeah. And Sophia makes statements such as that she was programmed to have feelings and that she loves her human compatriots and so on. She does that in this interview, but she's done that many times. She's done lots of interviews where she talks about herself as almost as a person. So do you think the Sophia robot is being deceptive? Okay, so good. So some people think that there's some deception. And do you think deception is a problem? Do you think robots should not be deceptive? Put your hands up if you think it's a problem. Okay, so about half again. And one reason, if you think it's a problem, is you might want to worry about that, is little Sophia is supposed to be available this year. I don't know if it will happen, but it's a miniature version of Big Sophia, and it's designed for kids' education. So I think it's actually quite a cool robot, but I understand why people have concerns about Sophia. So there's this question, and if you study the literature on robot ethics, you see that this is a big dividing line. People agree on lots of things, but there's a community that thinks that robots are deceptive and that's bad, and a community that disagrees with that. So there are two questions. Are robots deceptive? And if so, what should we do about it? I can put those responses into 4 different classes. I've got a short paper on it, which you can get on ResearchGate. It's a bit hard to find otherwise. So one answer is yes, but so what? We're okay with deception. Another answer is yes, and so we shouldn't have social robots altogether. I don't suppose there's anyone here takes that view, but there are people in the world who do. There's another view that yes, they're deceptive, but let's just design out the deception. And the fourth view is it's complicated, which is the view that I support. So quickly go through those. The first view, yes, but so what? So Ron Atkin is particularly associated with this view. So there's this paper. where they talk about deception, and they make the point that human social behavior generally is also deceptive, that we're not always completely honest in our social behavior, and that we don't always ultra tell the truth. So we also have artifacts like pacifiers for babies and dolls for kids, which you could argue are deceptive. This was actually Edison built a doll, a talking doll, back in the 1890s. So things like social robots like Sophia aren't completely new. Edison's talking doll wasn't quite Sophia, but for his age, it was probably as mind-blowing. We judge whether human deception is ethical based on our perception of people's motives rather than on their actions. I think that's quite an interesting point. So if somebody is being deceptive, but they're doing it for a good motive, you know, what people call a white lie, then we're generally okay about it. You know, if you're upset about something and you go to somebody's birthday party and they ask you how you are, you don't want to bring them down by telling them you're unhappy. So you might say you're fine. So objectively, you're deceiving, but ethically, you might agree that that's an okay thing to do. Humans are also sophisticated beings. We're smart enough to recognize that there's deception in human behavior and there will be in robot behavior. And they argue that we need to build a certain amount of deception into robot behavior for them to be effectively anthropomorphic. So the second option is to say that robots are deceptive and therefore we just shouldn't build robots. Sherry Turkle has kind of taken that position. She was initially very enthusiastic, but then she kind of Road to Damascus experience, which she describes in a book, and decided that social robots were a really bad thing. The Sparrows have said that to have emotions in robot is morally deplorable because it's based on illusion, it's based on deception. So these authors argue that it's both bad and there's nothing we can do about it, that we should stop building social robots. Joanna Bryson, you may have come across her view with Rob Wortham and other people. They argue that we can avoid deception in robots by designing them to be transparent, so that people always see them as machines. And they did an experiment where the robot continuously talked about the program that was running, so that people wouldn't be deceived as to thinking it was smarter than it was. The robot would chatter on about what it was doing and why it was doing what it was doing, because it was running this simple program. And this idea is actually in the EPSFC principles of robotics, so it's quite out there. And the view that it's complicated is one of the places it comes from. I don't know if you've seen this movie. This is the Hyder and Simmel movie. It's three simple geometric forms which are animated to appear as agents. So as you watch this animated movie, you can see them moving around in space. Some dramatic music would help here, I think. What people generally see is that the big triangle has cornered the little circle in this room, and then the little circle gets rescued by the little triangle, who are best friends and they escape together. So that is almost a universal response when people watch this movie. And so if people read emotion and intent into geometric forms, albeit they are animated to do interesting behavior, then I think there's little hope that we'll be able to build social robots that do anything usefully social without people reading in intentions and emotions. The second point is there are different kinds of anthropomorphism, and hopefully I have time to talk about this, but the idea is that there could be honest anthropomorphism and dishonest. And similarly, there can be different kinds of deception, and John Danaher has talked a lot about this. So I'm going to quickly try and cover both of these points. So the idea of honest anthropomorphism is if you're using anthropomorphism to sort of scaffold the social contact and make it work better, then that's okay. But if you're using anthropomorphism to deceive, then that's a problem. And an example would be if you have a social robot with a humanoid face and it has eyes, like Moxie robot here, but it also has a camera. then what you shouldn't do is close the visible eyes, but still watch the child through the camera, because when the eyes are shut, when the sort of TV eyes are shut, a human being would assume that the robot can no longer see because of anthropomorphism. So covertly observing somebody by a hidden camera would be a form of dishonest anthropomorphism. There are other robots which also have similar risks. So this is DreamC from PAL. So you've got an optional rear-facing camera. So people generally assume that if I've got my back to you, I can't see you. But if I'm a robot with a rear-facing camera, then I can still see you. So that might be an issue in a care home. If the care robot turns around, you think it's not looking, but if it's got a back-facing camera, obviously it can see what you're doing. And John Danaher has talked about different kinds of deception. Just go and look at that paper if you want to know more. And he's argued from a viewpoint he calls ethical behaviorism, is that there are some kinds of anthropomorphism which are fine. So I just want to finish, got 5 minutes? Yeah, with what I call the relational view. There's a big difference, I think, between what I would call an ontological perspective and a psychological perspective. So when we think about robots, we think of them as having certain kinds of properties because they're machines, but we also might think of them as having other kinds of properties because they're AIs. And those properties might be similar to ones we see in people, more psychological. So there's what we think a robot is, and there's also how we perceive a robot. And what I've tried to argue is that people will perceive robots as intentional a lot of the time. So people will see robots from the intentional stance, and they may not think of them necessarily as a machine. And the question is, what do we do about that? There are actually 4 different ways that you can combine how we think of machines and how we see robots. So in the top left there, you can see a robot as a machine, and you can think of it as a machine. So we say that ontologically and psychologically, we're just treating the thing as a machine. But over here in 2, the robots are machines, but we see them as more than machines. So I put P+. And then down here, the robot could be more than a machine, and we could also see as a more machine, more like as more than a machine. This is kind of the science fiction scenario where we have self-aware robots and so on. And these different perspectives are important. Now, the relational view of human-robot interaction says that it matters less what the robot is in its kind of essential nature and more what humans think about and care about in relation to the robot. So what matters is more the pattern and consequences of the interaction, the meaning and significance of that interaction to the people, and the wider impacts on the social and relational context. That's the viewpoint, that we shouldn't care so much about what a robot is, but more about how a robot is seen by people. Why do I think the relational view is right? Because with my collaborator, Julie Robillard, we've looked at the literature on human-human relationships. And it's clear that, you know, we judge other people not by our insides, but by our overt behavior. What Danaher called ethical behaviorism is the way we treat other people. You could argue that's the way we should behave towards robots. We should treat them based on what they do rather than what we think they are inside their essences. It's also more of a consequentialist approach, which if you study ethics means that it's more about the consequences of what happens rather than having some rule-based idea of what is right and wrong. It also stems, I think, from a cognitive science view about what is the essence of a human, because people will make the case that humans are uniquely emotional, for example, and that robots could never have emotions. But they do that on the basis of not having a good understanding of what human emotions are either. So as the science of human emotion unfolds, it may well be that we can build something for robots which is close or close enough to human emotion that we might agree that it's the same thing. So I don't think you can rule out this idea that robots can be more like humans in interesting ways. I think also that modern views in cognitive science emphasize the interaction of the brain and the body with the environment, including the social environment, and that what makes something emotional isn't intrinsic to the person or to the robot, it's to do with the interaction. So it's about the relationship. You may have come across David Gunkel. He has written a book called Robot Rights, and he talks about this relational view there as well. He says, the issue is not can machines have rights, but should machines have rights? So it's a query about how we decide to relate and respond to them. In other words, he says, it's up to us to decide if we want robots to have rights. In the same way, it's up to us to decide if we want elephants and chimpanzees to have rights. And historically, we have gone down that path of deciding rights. Other things should have rights besides just humans. So based on this relational view in that paper, and I'm not going to go into it here, I've put forward with Julie some ideas about how we can ethically design robots, including emotional robots and expressive robots and so on, around this idea of having honest anthropomorphism, signaling what the robot is doing, and also contextual integrity. I don't think this is discussed enough. The idea is that the behavior of the robot should be compatible with norms and expectations. So if you meet a robot in a restaurant, then perhaps it's fine if the robot is overhearing your conversation. If you're at home, with your partner, perhaps it's not fine if the robot is overhearing your conversation. So depending on the context, then what's right or not right for the robot makes a difference. And Julie and her collaborators, if I propose this idea, that actually we could make better social robots, including therapy robots, if we could match the emotions that the robot expresses with the emotions of the people that they're operating alongside. So thanks to all the people that have worked on the different experiments and studies, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Tony. Do we have any questions? Yes, Dimitri.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering a bit of the way intentional stance is investigated now, because since the study you mentioned much is from 2016, other studies have been made, and it seems, unless I'm mistaken, that they are mostly focusing on the distinction between intentional stance and design stance only. Do you think that it would change if we included the four original stances proposed by the net or the same results?
Yeah, and I talked to Agnieszka about this and think she's really interested in that. So I think when you say that somebody's taking an intentional stance towards a robot, I don't think that's necessarily exclusive. So I think actually people can swap between those stances. And one of the things that is quite exciting about the work in Genera is that they think they can detect a marker of the intentional stance from brain activity, which they measure through EEG. So they think they can see when somebody's taking the intentional stance. And I think when people interact with the robot, they can actually take a range of different stances. So in a way, I think our experiment with kids is this kind of forced choice, more like a person, more like a machine. But of course, a robot can be like a person and like a machine at the same time. So you can take the design stance towards the robot and the intentional stance towards the robot, kind of in parallel, or you could swap between them, or depending what you're thinking about. So if a robot fell off the stage, you'd immediately think of it as a physical thing, wonder if it was broken. If the robot was interacting you socially, you may be thinking of it intentionally. If we're at a conference and we're looking at this cool robot, you'd be wondering about how it's designed and who built it, and so on. So I think people are quite sophisticated, and even children, I think, can think of a robot as being intentional, but also designed. There's this idea of the phenomenological stance. I can't really say the word, but I really like that idea because there's at least one study that suggests that people who take the intentional stance towards agents, I think there might have been avatars in that experiment, were less likely to take the phenomenological stance. So it might be true for robots that you see it having goals and intentions, but you don't see it as having a self and inner life. So there could be a distinction that is worth looking at.
Is there, sorry to catch up on that, but is there some studies about how humans are the same to other humans? Because it's interesting to see that seeing agents as intentional is quite compromising for them as them phenomenological, sorry.
You need a better word. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't really know that the literature on the attention stance that way.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any other question?
I think online.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You can increase the volume. Yeah.
So here, that's what was wrong. Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I am Andrea Bertolini. I'm from Italy. Actually, I couldn't make it to the event because I'm teaching these days. I also work on deception. I'm a lawyer.
Okay.
We actually met before. And to sum it up, I would say that I'm closer to Joanna Bryson's stance. But
Right.
what I like, so I very much like the idea of seeing the relational perspective between the machine and the human being. But I think that there is something intrinsic to the human relationship that induces me to call the one with the machine a mere interaction, because a relationship, I can also have it with an animal, is both ways. So I behave in a way, and then there is a response by the other entity that is that perceives me, perceives my existence, and is free to choose for himself which way actually it wants to be. So relationships are hard because people can disappoint you. A dog that you might want to caress might bite you back. That is completely absent in the machine. So I really believe that looking into studies in sociology, I really think that you cannot call the one with the machine a relationship, but rather an interaction. And so the deceptive dimension I see there is really that you're replacing a relationship that you can have with a living being or something that is aware of its own existence and free to decide how to react, with an interaction that can be very sophisticated, but it's still something that in terms of quality, and it's not based on, it's still based on an observation. It's not, you could still see as a not necessarily an ontological perspective, I think, but to some extent, it's also consequential. It's based on the fact that it can be disappointed. It can be how the machine will react to me cannot be unless it's intentionally programmed to be harmful, disappointing, or something like that. Whereas in the real relationship, all that is possible. So it's not me determining how the thing, the other entity will react to my input. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things there. So first of all, I would agree with you that robots aren't sophisticated enough yet to give rich interactions similar to human relationship. But I would also say there are lots of different kinds of human relationship. And not all of them are two-way. So we've just seen in the UK this remarkable thing of people queuing for 16 hours to walk past the coffin of somebody that they've never met. Clearly, they had a really strong tie and bond to this person, where it was not necessarily a one-way relationship, but there certainly wasn't a direct relationship of those two people to each other. So we have all kinds of human relationships. And I think some of those aspects of human relationships we can capture in robots, including right now. And in the iScience paper I did with Julie Robillard, we talked about that variety of human relationship. So when people mean you can't have a true relationship with a robot, they often refer to Aristotle's idea of virtual friendship. And this is the idea that those kinds of relationship can only happen between equals. And I would say two things about that. One is that Aristotle isn't the only model for friendship. There's a Buddhist model where good friends are people that are supportive and consistent, that they're always there for you, they're helpful, they're respectful, all these other things that actually robots can do. And Aristotle's idea that it has to be an equal, there could be maybe a few relationships like this, but in relationship science, people recognize that even most of the relationships we care about are not equal in that sense. So I do think that robots should behave more in accord with their capabilities. So I think it would be better, for example, if robots didn't talk as effusively as they do right now, because they understand so little. So one of the issues we have with robots is they can easily generate interesting speech, but they have very little comprehension of anybody else's speech. And that creates a disappointment and a disconnect. And that's the opposite of human social interaction, because when we're learning to speak, we're much better at listening than we are at generating. So I think I agree with you about some things, but I think the relational view actually suggests a different way of measuring whether things are right or not. The sort of ethical behaviorism stance, I think, can address some of your concerns, because it's actually really quite hard to build a robot that will be consistent and reliable and therefore be a friend in this more Buddhist sense.
Thank you.